Merci Roger.
Thank you very much, Roger.
Je crois en effet que, compte tenu de
Indeed,
la qualité de mon anglais
given
et de la très bonne
my
qualité
English
des
and
traducteurs de l'OCDE,
the
je pense que si
fact that
je
we
fais
have
ma présentation
OECD
en français,
interpreters who can
cela est
interpret
pour
us
vous
very well,
montrer
I will present
qu'avec
in
la
French and I have
traduction de
my
l'OCDE,
slides in English.
nous sommes à un optimum de part et d'autre.
Uh, so I think that
Je
that is
commence
the
par
best
remercier
configuration
toute la
for
chronologie
the
sur laquelle se
intervention. I'll
distinguent
begin
quelques
with
dates
a
qui
quick
permettent
chronology, a
de
timeline.
signaler que
I
l'article
have
séminal de Jules Dupuy
first of
1817
all started with the
entame, comme
seminal
par
article
hasard
of Jules
évoqué,
Dupuy in
d'Alfred Marshall sur le
1844,
surplus
based on
de
the work of
consommateurs, parce que
Alfred Marshall
c'est le
on
premier exemple, me semble-t-il,
surpluses,
dans la
because it
longue
seems to
liste
me
de
the
progrès
first
qui ont été
example
faits
in
sur
the long
l'évaluation
list of
et
progress
en
that's been
somme
made on appraisals
l'intégration d'effets
of
élargis pour
integrating all
l'économie
of
et
the
c'est-à-dire
wider
davantage. C'est le premier
benefits
exemple
and
de la
impacts
monnaie web
on an economic
qui est
level. It's the first
introduit sur le
example
web
of
étant
a web
naturellement
that was introduced,
l'avantage
that
pour les usagers
web
de
being the
l'ouvrage
advantage
dont
for
dont
users
l'usage est gratuit.
of
Tout le
free
reste est
availability of public
de la
transport
même, ça ne
or of
porte pas le génie de
infrastructure.
Dupuis, mais c'est de même nature, c'est-à-dire tous
In
les
the
progrès ensuite
same
me semble-t-il, ont été
light, all progress since that
une
time, it
réussite
seems
dans
to me,
la
has
monétisation et
constituted a
l'intégration au
success in the
calcul économique
monetization and
d'effets
integration
d'annonce.
in
Je signale, je
economic
pose
calculations
de
of
la date de 82 mais je vais
broader
bien noter
economic
parce que
effects.
c'est depuis le
I
mois de cette date
also mentioned
en
the
obligation en France
date of
de faire
1982 because it is
ex
since that
post.
date that
Je
we have
signale
had
aussi
an obligation under
la
French law
date
to
de
carry out ex
2005
post
parce que je voudrais
evaluations.
revenir tout à la fin de
Also,
ma
the year
présentation.
2005, which I will come
Il y
back
a
to
eu
at the end of
une
my presentation.
modification dans les
In
règles officielles
2005, there was
d'évaluation
a
qui avait été
modification in
produite en
the official
2004 et qui a été modifiée
evaluation
en
rules
2005
that were produced
parce
in
qu'on observe que les résultats
2004
de
originally.
recherche récents
In
ont
2005,
fait
recent
changer
research was
le
integrated
critère
into the
de
thinking that changed
l'ordre de
the
réalisation des projets.
criterion
Jusque-là,
concerning
il
the
convenait que
order
les tests
of
officiels aient
implementation of
commencé
projects.
par les
Until
projets
that
à forte
time,
rentabilité socio-économique
projects
et à
of
partir de
high
2005, les
socioeconomic
textes
profitability
officiels ont
were to be given
proposé
priority,
un
and from
ordre de
2005
réalisation qui était le
onwards,
ratio
the
valeur
order was
caractérisée nette
changed.
du
The
projet
net
par subvention
value
nécessaire à sa réalisation.
of
Un
a
ratio en somme
project
value,
with regard to the levels of
value pour
subsidies
monnaie sur lequel je reviendrai.
required for their implementation
Alors,
became the priority, and so
très,
value
très
for
vite
money
sur
uh,
ces bilans
came
LOTI,
to the front of
c'était en somme quelque chose
or
d'assez
to the
banal
forefront.
que de rendre obligatoire
Making
ces
compulsory
évaluations rétrospectives.
these
Ça
ex
relève
post
de ce qu'on appelle le retour
evaluations
d'expérience, mais il faut savoir qu'il ne faisait pas
was part
tellement
of a
partie de
whole
notre
concept
culture en
of
France.
feedback,
Et
but it
les
was
trois
completely
objectifs qui ont
new
été
to our
avancés vont
culture in France. So
paraître
these
très
through
ordinaires, très
objectives
évidents.
may seem
D'abord, qu'ils sont
self-evident,
informés
but
le public
they were revolutionary at the
sur
time.
les
First of
éventuelles
all,
divergences
informing
entre
the
ce que l'on
public with
observe
regard to
ex
possible
post et ce
divergences
qui avait
between
été
what you
prévu,
observe ex post and what had been
en
planned for the
particulier sur
project,
des
in
éléments qui avaient
particular
été
with
donnés
regard to
sur les avantages du projet.
uh, the
Ensuite,
information that had
bien
been given concerning the benefits
reporter
of
et
the
informer
project.
le public sur
Secondly,
la bonne
informing
évaluation
the
des fonds
public,
publics. Ça
reporting
se
on
traduit
the
naturellement par le
assessment
fait
of
que
public funds
sur toutes
used.
ces dimensions
Today, that
économiques,
is
sociales, environnementales,
realized in the
il
form
faut
of
vérifier que les rentabilités avaient été
socio-economic
calculées sur
feasibility
les mêmes
studies, which
rendez-vous.
involve
Et enfin,
checking that
produire
the benefits that
un
had been
retour
anticipated
d'expérience,
were
un
actually
feedback
realized. And
qui
then
permettent
thirdly,
d'améliorer
feedback, which makes it
progressivement
possible to
les
progressively
évaluations
improve
successives.
successive
Alors, je vais
evaluations.
donner une, une, pardon. Je vais donner
I'm now going
première
to
illustration, mais en les
give you
résumant
a
beaucoup,
first illustration, but I'll be
sur toutes ces
summarizing a great
leçons
deal.
qu'on peut retirer du bilan
First, a
LOTI,
summary
et
of
en
the lessons that
particulier
we've
sur
drawn from the reports
les
on
bilans
the
LOTI
French
relatifs aux
uh,
autoroutes.
Public
Je commencerai
Transport
par
Act, which
cela.
is known by the
Et je
acronym
donne un
LOTI,
exemple
LOTI.
de
I'll
quelque
give you an
chose qui, à mon avis,
example
a bien
of
servi.
something which I believe has been very useful.
D'abord, en général,
First of all, these balance sheets, these studies, have revealed that in ex ante studies, we have tended to underestimate traffic, and so we have had pleasant surprises once the projects have been implemented. On the other hand, we've systematically had disappointing results with regard to profitability. In almost all cases, this has been related to cost overruns. And finally, when we look at these French Public Transport Act ex post evaluations, we have seen that the evaluations, the projects have been relatively insufficient in terms of their anticipation of the broader benefits. So I'll tell you also about the things that we've learned with regard to motorway projects, traffic and forecasting. For motorway projects, we've studied the forecasts and then the ex post observations or evaluations. When observations have been insufficient, generally speaking, that has corresponded to times when the results have been less good than forecast, and when we have had extensive observation, the results have tended to be better. But we have a difference in the level of results before the year 2000 and the year and after the year 2000. And that's not because we moved into a new millennium. It's because we began to take into account the fact that there was a non-negligible proportion of projects where there was overestimation of the benefits. In the official texts, the laws governing evaluations, improvements were made in response to those observations. The improvements were as follows. The government authorities suggested more cautious hypotheses with regard to growth prospects resulting from these motorway projects. So the forecasts were based on more reasonable hypotheses with regard to mobility and traffic, and that has made it possible afterwards to greatly limit the risk of overestimating the benefits of a project. With regard to high-speed rail lines, if we conduct a kind of comparison, I've tried to summarize this in a single table, which you have on the screen. Only 6 columns, so that only covers 6 high-speed lines which have been subjected to the French public transport law evaluations, the LOTI studies, and they run from 1992 to 2007. I've only listed a certain number of the objectives under the law, so whether profitability has been as anticipated in the ex-ante studies. Now, there's a common thread for all of these projects: disappointing results, systematically less profitability once the project is implemented than was forecast. The explanations for this phenomenon are not so much connected to traffic forecasting. When that was over-optimistic, it was not disastrously so. The explanation, systematically enough, relates to cost overruns. And I would add another explanation, which has tended to be forgotten in the LOTI evaluations, the French Public Transport Act evaluations. They did not take account of delays in the opening of those services. So one project overran by 3 years. It opened 3 years later than initially anticipated. It was supposed to be a 4-year project. It blew out to 7 years. The mechanical effects of these delays on profitability then, as a result of these observations, were integrated into the evaluations, and I give other examples showing that in my report. These tendencies had consequences. The latest 3 high-speed lines were not carried out by the same operator. So you're seeing projects on screen which were either from the French National Rail Authority, SNCF, or our rail network company, Réseau de France, which was set up in 1997. The most recent projects as a result of these observations were carried out in the form of public-private partnerships, 2 partnerships and 1 concession, and I'll come back to those a bit later. Generally speaking, the French public transport law evaluations have been fairly modest in their accounting for wider economic benefits. And that is partly because those broader benefits were greatly stressed in the initial study dossiers which preceded the announcement of the project. So when the project was initially announced, a great deal of emphasis was placed on those broader economic benefits, and the operators tend to go to great trouble to make the projects as attractive as possible in that degree. There are a few gaps in the LOTI evaluations. One flagrant example of that there is a great insistence in public announcements that there will be a large-scale creation of jobs as a result of the project, and that is always something that is favorably received. But in these high-speed line projects, only one was subjected to an evaluation, and that evaluation finds that jobs created are roughly half of what was forecast. Generally speaking, the LOTI reports only give a limited amount of information about the wider economic benefits. They're mentioned. Quite often, the ultimate results are a little disappointing. One thing must be said is that in the specific case of motorway projects, there have been permanent observation systems put in place, generally speaking, with agreements between the university institutes, which sometimes were initiating those agreements, and the motorway concession holders who are interested in feeding into the future ex-post evaluation of that project. Now, just a few words about the benefit of these permanent observatories. I'll give you a few examples, but before that, I'll just give you a bit of background information. Now, I can personally say that this is a well thought out initiative that involves the motorway operators as well, but they run into 3 main difficulties in terms of the ex-post studies. Some of the mechanisms studied are quite transitory, quite ephemeral, everything that relates to the work construction sites and so on. Retrospectively, it's difficult to assess a work site that has been dismantled. Then we have cases of evaporation of data. Some of that data is just no longer available. And then anyone who has conducted studies after the fact, interviewing people, will notice that there is a retrospective loss of memory quite often. Psychologists even discuss what they call rationalization in this regard to lost memory.
Difficultés-là, ayant saisi ces difficultés sur des premières expériences, des responsables de sociétés d'autoroutes ont
Some heads of motorway companies financed permanent observatories. The Ministry of Transport supported this, and there were about a dozen permanent observatories, and I give you some results in my report, which are very interesting. The main challenge here is that often context is very specific, and it is difficult to generalize, of course. I should point out that none of the high-speed lines have benefited from a permanent observatory so far. On the contrary, 3 new high-speed lines were opened in 2017. There were private-public partnerships, and they could benefit from a permanent observatory. I come to the example of the Socioeconomic Observatory of the SEA high-speed line, and I'll provide a few details on this project. I think most of you know a little about the project. It is a 300 kilometers high-speed line. There are 38 kilometers of connections. It goes from Tours to Bordeaux, so it extends the Paris to Bordeaux connection. Bordeaux is a city in the southwest of France, close to the Atlantic Ocean. The project cost 7.7 billion euros, and with a public funding amounting to 51%. It cost 7.7 billion euros after a call for offers, and it was after the final negotiations, and it amounted to 7.8 billion euros eventually. And in the end, it was 7.7, so they stuck to this amount. And there were no delays. They were even finished a month early, so we will have to see about profitability. What is interesting, given our topic today, is that the concession contract made it mandatory for the concessionaire to organize and finance a permanent observatory. And even more interesting, this observatory was set up 5 years before commissioning, as soon as the concession contract was signed, and it must operate until 2027, which is 10 years after commissioning. I have to admit, when I was asked to work and hold my current position, which takes a lot of time, I agreed to chair the scientific committee of the observatory. Well, that was a real pleasure for me. I was very curious. I think it is a great opportunity to witness this observatory in 15 years, and we know the structuring effects will be progressive effects. I will show what these observatories can bring, what benefits there can be. And I should also show the shortfalls of these retrospective studies. The problem of ephemeral mechanisms. A thesis was funded by the University of Poitiers. Poitiers is a city that is on the high-speed line, and a very meticulous work was led. They identified anything that was spent for these works, and of course, they relied on the usual methods which we try to implement in such cases, and namely by calculating multiplying effects, intersectoral effects that can lead to local measures that are measures such as trying to find out what impacts there were on catering, on restaurants in the region. Of course, I was not able to translate this graph into English. It shows the multiplying effect, I will simply provide a summary below. And for 1 billion euros injected, well, it seems as though it is 1 billion euros that will benefit the region, but things aren't that simple. Out of 1,000 million euros, there are only 326 million euros that do benefit the region that is crossed. But with the intersectoral multiplying effect, there is an increase in regional production amounting to 604 million euros, which is significant. And it will create approximately 14,000 jobs, full-time jobs over a year. These figures are interesting because, in my opinion, it is the first time in France that we have precise and robust figures and data relating to these calculations pertaining to the works. This might not be applicable to other works, but it provides us ballpark figures that are very interesting. Another example, it has to do with data evaporation. I wanted to provide an example of figures that no longer exist. The permanent observatory worked on fares, and to understand this graph, you need to look at the months on the right, July to December, and what we observe is the changes in fares each month compared to the months the year previously, prior to commissioning. And this applies to all modes that are involved. It had to do with buses. There were carpooling services, airfares afterwards, and then you have the different fares for train tickets. If I provide you with these results, that is because I want to point out that first, we will need such elements if we want serious calculations of profitability, if we want to calculate variations in consumer surplus. We know that we cannot calculate these variations without knowing what changes there were in fares. So such elements are essential. Second, none of the figures you have here could have been available today. They are all evaporated. I checked. This data has evaporated. All of this data. Consequently, this means that we will only be able to provide approximate figures with other challenge that has to do with loss of memory of the actors involved. I think there are 3 essential topics. There are others, but these are the essential ones. First, the role of the new high-speed line and what happened with the construction of these high-speed lines in stations and their neighborhoods. So we had to survey and ask questions to local actors and private stakeholders to see how these station neighborhoods changed and what role the high-speed line played. Second topic, the creation of companies, how these companies spread in space. did the building of this high-speed line play an important role in the location of these new companies? Of course, we focused on the creation of mostly on digital and consulting companies. And the third topic, that is what we call city networks. There is an urban hierarchy, and those can change and be transformed when there are changes in the connections between cities using transport. Cities that are connected to Paris, for instance. Changes happen, and this can be either metropolization or diffusion, and this is interesting. I now come to my final issues. First, the issue of spatial equity and redistribution. This is, of course, a complex matter, and from what I heard yesterday, I have the feeling that what I will say is perfectly obvious and not as in-depth as what was presented by Yoram, for example. But I focused on an issue which I will try to tackle. How can we integrate these elements to the economic calculus? On these graphs, I presented two projects. On the right, a redistributive project where aggregates of consumer surplus in zone I focuses on regions on the right with low accessibility index. Here you have the surplus that goes to low accessibility areas, so we can say that it is a redistributive project. On this project on the left, most of the consumer surplus goes towards high accessibility regions, so we can say that it is a rather regressive project. But generally speaking, this project is more profitable than the project on the right. So the question is quite simple, and maybe we already have the answer to the question: how can we integrate to the economic calculus arbitration between a redistributive objective and a profitability objective? To do so, we need to go back to the actual economic calculus, and the way we calculate profitability, we calculate the welfare function, which is the sum of variations in costs, revenue, and consumer surplus aggregated per zone I. I did not add to the equation other elements that are usually mentioned today, such as effects or impacts on the environment. Of course, the values you have here are actualized and updated values in an economic calculus. We know that this equation is only legitimate because sometimes it is not clearly said, but there's the hypothesis that the decision maker does not take into account the distribution of surpluses, which is to whom the project will benefit. And this is what we call in economic theory the optimal distribution of income. So the additional dollar or the additional euro can benefit anyone because it is only a euro or a dollar. Works have been done in this field and in the field of neo-utilitarianism. I looked into this, and there is a very simple variation, and it is very simple indeed, but I still find it interesting. And we simply introduce a weight on consumer surplus. And using a neo-utilitarianism equation, we can reach this. The accessibility indicator. And once again, all of this is very simple. And we can then weight the variations in consumer surplus. What I observe is that the equation has a benefit. Alpha is a good representation of the aversion to inequality, and in this case, to spatial inequality, because I provided an accessibility indicator, but we could easily apply the same to social inequality. And we mentioned this yesterday in one of the presentations. Just an additional remark, if alpha equals 0, then we have the conventional form. Unfortunately, I do not have a practical example. It is very difficult to implement. Not so long ago, a PhD student worked on the topic and made progress, but she married an American husband and had to give up on her thesis. So with a few colleagues, we're trying to set up a research project, because it is not so easy to go from a traffic appraisal that is aggregated per zone to such equations, because in most cases, the spatial distribution is difficult to integrate. So we had to find very appropriate examples.
Ce ne sera pas sans relation avec cette partie. Là, j'ai un exemple à vous montrer.
Now I have an example to show you here. I'll be talking about the ex post evaluation of the ranking of a project.
On résume une programmation des choses pour 5 ans, 10 ans, 12 ans.
We wanted to know whether the actual order ranking has meant that there was a loss in the economic value compared with the original project. We had made a suggestion, a proposal for a ratio, an efficiency indicator for global efficiency. That's the ratio between the welfare function variation that would exist thanks to an actual program and the variation of the welfare function with a program which would be the optimal program, that is the top in the ranking, a top program. This optimal ranking is accurate. It is established by assuming the project selected in the decreasing order of the ratio, that is the value for money, with a budget constraint which is the same as the one observed on the actual real program. We know that public money is spent at for a given amount, and the theoretical optimal program will assume the same public subsidy, but we consider the decreasing order of the ratio. And we've had a panel discussion with two friends who were
de la stratégie à la SNCF, directeur des études
a director of strategy at SNCF and a director of economic strategy at SNCF Networks. So we made this calculation together. We took some 40 projects covering a 12-year period, and we compared what would have been the actual discounted value of a program with an optimal ranking and compare it with the actual real program as it was made with the same public funds for each year of the program. And you see there's a kind of loss. The optimal program has a net present value of several million euros, but the actual ranking only generated 110. So it's only 9% of this efficiency indicator. But when you look into the details of this work and the papers that we have published further to this work, we wanted not to disclose the name of the regions involved for reasons that are easy to understand. And also because there were a few minor mistakes and we didn't want to blame the beneficiaries. But all this can be weighed with an additional calculation, which was made by our friends from SNCF. And they took the actual program as it was completed and achieved, deducting all the other projects that did have a negative discounted value. And then we would compare with the following, the other programs. And if there were still means to fund at the end of the program, we would compare them with the best ranking programs. And in this case, the efficiency indicator was 92%, meaning that in simple terms, the loss, which seemed to be quite impressive here, with the 9% for the actual ranking, is the consequence of the fact that some projects were completed in some regions which were considered as poorly accessible. And if you remember what I shown in the previous graphs on accessibility, they were in the lower end of the accessibility. So it was considered that these regions were to be the focus of a particular additional effort in terms of investment. I'm not saying that we should have had the equivalent of the left-hand side column or the right-hand column. I'm not judging here, but the interest of such calculations shows that the distributive decision would have been relevant and that it was certainly politically justified in terms of public policies, but at least this ex post evaluation shows us what was the actual cost. The actual cost was slightly more than 1 billion euros. So it's a way of reintroducing these indicators in this calculation. I hope I wasn't too long, and I thank you for your attention.